Yes? No, no. Oh, yeah, I have a pen. I have a pen, yeah. Yes. I have your questions.
Okay. Feel free to make any change. Yes, shall we start? Ready? We are on time this time, okay? So hello everyone, my name is Cristina Mas and I'm happy to introduce you today our guest speaker, Amitav Acharya. Mr. Acharya is one of the most influential academic in international relations today, with a critical view about two Western focus view and the importance of non-state actors. At the time where Europe suffers again the horrors of the war, a view of the world, of Europe and Ukraine from the global south could be helpful for a wider perspective. Mr. Acharya is the UNESCO Chair of Transnational Challenges and Governance and Distinguished Professor at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington. He was the first non-Western scholar to be elected as the President of the International Studies Association. He has previously worked as professor at York University in Toronto, at the University of Bristol in the UK, and he is currently honorary professor at Rhodes University in South Africa and guest professor at Nankai University in China. So we'll have about 1 hour for this first Q&A, and after I'll open the floor for the questions from the audience. We should finish by 8 o'clock, so please don't be shy when you need to raise your hand to ask your questions. Welcome to Barcelona, Professor Acharya.
Thank you.
This is a very interesting time to be discussing about world order, I guess. So thank you very much for joining us. My first questions, I will try to be a little bit provocative. Less than 3 years ago, French President Mr. Emmanuel Macron argued that NATO was experiencing brain death. 3 weeks ago, we had here in Madrid the last leaders summit of the alliance, where it seemed to return to life, to be resuscitated. Does the Russian invasion of Ukraine revive the idea of the West?
Yes, it is a provocative question, but first of all, thank you very much for having me here today, and especially to CCCB. I'm very interested in your institution because it's about culture. It's not just about politics. And so I would like to know more about what contemporary culture means here, but certainly something I think a very important part of the changing global order. So in that context, your question on NATO, I guess the best way I can answer that is to compare NATO with a cat. You know, the saying, I don't know, you have in Spanish, but in English there is a saying, a cat has 9 lives.
Here we say 7, no?
A cat has 9, you have something in Spanish, I'm sure. Every culture has.
But it's only 7 in our case, sorry. It's
okay.
only 7 for us.
Okay, so NATO is like a cat which has 9 lives. Or you can call NATO something that, you know, comes back from the dead. It never really dies out. So after the end of the Cold War, people thought NATO is obsolete. And then, of course, there was the 9/11, the global war on terror. So NATO got into the business of the war on terror. Then, of course, part of that was Afghanistan. NATO going to Afghanistan. But before that, when you have conflict in Bosnia, Kosovo. So NATO kind of invented missions to legitimize, to justify its continuation. And why is that is very interesting. And people might disagree here with my view. But everywhere in the world, I'm not saying just in the United States, but I am particularly sensitive to this because I live in Washington, D.C. There is a military, bureaucratic, industrial elite. President Eisenhower called it the military industrial complex. But now you can add military, industrial, bureaucratic think tank complex, which basically cannot live without conflict, because that's what they do. And so, to me, NATO, the cat, is also a question of demonstrating what is called a self-fulfilling prophecy, that you think of a conflict and you work to prevent it, but while you are doing that, you contribute to that conflict. Self-fulfilling prophecy. So NATO is a bit of both, that it is lucky also because conflicts keep coming back, but NATO was not supposed to be doing all these conflicts. Now, NATO is considered to be, or claimed to be, a defensive alliance. That's nonsense. NATO has long stopped being a defensive alliance. The NATO of the Cold War, which was genuinely a defensive alliance, has taken on many different responsibilities. When I wrote my PhD thesis 30 years ago, I actually had a chapter called NATO and out-of-area contingencies. Now, I interviewed people in NATO. I've actually been to NATO headquarters, but also many times to the NATO division in the US Defense Department. And there was a big controversy whether NATO should limit itself to being a defensive alliance, for which it has the charter, it has the mandate, it has the experience, or take on all these, the so-called out-of-area threats. These out-of-area threats then become global threats. And with the war on terror, Afghanistan, and humanitarian intervention, NATO is into humanitarian intervention, into war on terror, and many others. Regime change, legally or illegally. And why that is happening is because it has a constituency of a combination of elites, military, industrial, bureaucratic, and think tank elites, which brings up justification. I know several of them personally, and they're extremely smart people. But somehow they're hardwired into thinking, and very dark, realist view of the world, nothing wrong with that. But they walk in a way, think in a way, it, to me, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that is the answer to, maybe in a long-winded way, to what Emmanuel Macron said, that NATO is brain dead. Well, a lot of people would agree with him, because NATO had no vision, no purpose at that time. But then, and this is the time when France was trying to develop a European defense role, autonomy, defense autonomy. And especially when Donald Trump basically was not very interested in NATO. In fact, he was accusing NATO allies for free riding on the US. So he said that, but then NATO, I had no doubt that NATO will find some way out of this. There is one other reason why NATO survives, is because NATO is not just an alliance to fight war. There is also a lot of training, a lot of intelligence sharing, a lot of, a long tradition of military cooperation that happens through NATO. And there are many countries that have got used to it. So even without a threat, common threat, they continue to benefit from this, and they continue with that.
Could you please bring your micro?
Yeah. So they continue to benefit from NATO, even if there is no threat, because of the training, the arms transfers, the intelligence sharing, and all this that continues because of NATO membership. And last but not the least, the new members. The new members absolutely love NATO because for the reason that it gives them protection against Russia, but also it sort of gives them an entry to the club of the West. I'm talking about the East and Central European members. And they basically sometimes drive that NATO's agenda. So all that leads me to say, make a very provocative statement here. The idea of Europe was once driven by France and Germany, the big European project. Okay, the idea of Europe is no longer driven by Germany and France, it's driven by Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, the new members, and the Baltic states. And this is where it's not just about NATO, it's also about Europe in general, since we're talking about Europe here as well. Anyway, that would be my answer to your first question. And I know there was another part of the question that was about the return of the West. Has the West come back?
Let me ask you something here.
Yeah,
because
I can come back to this later.
I've been foreign journalist for the last 25 years. And I never use the word West in my articles. And you see it all over, the big titles now. So this is coming back as a word, at least.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article about the return of the West in a blog called Responsible Statecraft. Now, it is published by a think tank in Washington called Quincy Institute. And those people basically want American restraint. They want to put an end to war without end. You might have heard about them, the Quincy Institute, relatively new think tank. And they asked me to write something about this. And so the title is not the return of the West, but it starts with that idea that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sweeping unprecedented sanctions imposed on Russia by United States, European allies, and also Australians and Japanese and some other states, this idea of the West become ascendant or re-emerged in a big way. So it's almost like going back to the end of the Cold War, that moment where people are talking about the end of history. Then the West was fading away since then. Now it come back. And the unity and the resolve that was apparent, even if not real, but apparent unity, and the speed with which the United States and its allies imposed very sweeping, unprecedented sanctions on Russia, got people to gloating, celebrating, in a sense of triumph. West is back. In fact, there was a blog in Council on Foreign Relations, "The West is back," by Stuart Patrick, a friend of mine. But this is very common. So my answer to that was not so fast, and for many reasons. First of all, I think it's a bad thing because every time you talk about the West, you are alienating the West from the rest, because it creates a division. It sort of revives the ideological idea of the West. This is one reason why many global South countries, even though they dislike and condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they don't necessarily buy into the Western agenda of reviving the American-led liberal order or sanctions. Like countries like Brazil and Mexico, they voted in the UN General Assembly against Russia, but they did not like the sanctions. They haven't joined the sanctions. So because of this idea that there is the West, the club, that is going to manage the world and is back. Now, it was not very popular during the Cold War. Now everybody is reminded of that period of the Cold War. It's a club of the powerful and the rich. There are memories of colonialism and racism. It has a baggage. The term has a baggage. So which is why it's not very popular. It actually alienates a lot of global South countries. But whether it will actually has come back is also questionable. I have already I wrote an article the day after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in Barron's magazine, published by the Wall Street, basically saying that, with Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe has become the world's most dangerous place. Now, that's the title of the article. Well, I actually gave the title, not the editors. Europe has just become the world's most dangerous place. Now, I can explain to you why, or you can read it. But the idea was that this idea of the West will not last very long, because sooner or later, there will be divisions within the West. There has always been division in the West. During the Cold War, the Germans never really are on board with the Reagan doctrine, for example. They had Ostpolitik. There were also people will not like it. There were peace movements. The whole idea, the birth of the European peace movement was during the Cold War period, because a lot of people didn't like the militarism of NATO. And then, of course, defense burden. When countries are going to be now spending more and more money on defense, so the peace dividend, so-called dividend, it was gone out the window. They have to pay more for energy. This is going to create divisions within the body politic of Western countries, which will then put pressure on certain governments, especially, maybe not the conservative governments, maybe not the right-wing governments, but governments like Emmanuel Macron, for example. So it will be a matter of time before the West fractures. Not fracture means completely destroys itself, but there will be deep divisions among the Western governments and also between the people and the governments. Now, at the same time, the idea of the West will create resentment in the rest of the world, in the so-called West. There's a very good article by the former Indian National Security Advisor. His name is Shiv Shankar Menon in Foreign Affairs. And it's called The Fantasy of the Free World. The Fantasy of the Free World. This guy, India is a big ally of the US, by the way, now, working on Indo-Pacific. But it also has good relations with Russia. So being asked to choose sides, Americans basically told India, not the senior people in the Biden administration, they're too smart, but the popular media and the Congress people, senators said India must choose. India is in the wrong side of history. Now, this is absolutely ridiculous in many ways, but it also to say that, make that demand that you have to take our side or you are our enemy. Just like John Foster Dulles used to say, you are either with us or we are against us. Now, again, brings back the idea of the West, divisive geopolitical concept. So all that to me says that the euphoria about the rise, a revival, re-emergence of the West is not going to last very long. And the idea to have a global NATO, by the way, that's going around. We had a meeting right here in Madrid. I mean, when the idea, it was not put in the communique as global NATO, but there were articles by James Lindsay and I guess there was an article, again, in Foreign Affairs publishes these sort of things, global NATO, globalized NATO, create a NATO in Asia, now create a NATO in Middle East, or expand NATO to make it global. Very dangerous idea, very, very dangerous idea, which will create more damage and will not ultimately succeed. And I can go about the idea of Asian NATO. I've actually done quite a bit of research on this and the idea of Asian NATO in the 1950s. But I will end up by saying one thing. The idea of expand a global NATO as the projection of the West tells me two things as a researcher. The first thing is that NATO has become the last bastion of a declining West, to put it provocatively, because economically, West cannot compete. While militarily, here is an instrument that has survived, and Western countries, United States is still militarily powerful. So that's the way to maintain US global hegemony. I'm not saying every European country is bought into this, but certainly a lot of people, well, one section of the elite in the US looks at it that way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it is a fantasy because what is global NATO for? It's basically link European security with East Asian security. So create either a NATO in Asia or extend NATO's mandate to Asia. Liz Truss, who is contesting for the British Prime Minister position to succeed Boris Johnson, she said that the idea that NATO security is only limited to Europe is out of date. So let's go to Indo-Pacific. The problem with that, I don't think there is a lot of geopolitical wisdom there. Europeans don't see China as an existential threat the way they see Russia. Asians don't see Russia as an existential threat the way some of them might see China. So what sort of geopolitical wisdom is to link the security of Europe with the security of Asia through a global NATO? And even countries like India, very much committed to Indo-Pacific, the Quad is not going to sign on to a global NATO or NATO presence in India. Because Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, the founding Prime Minister, was actually a very strong critique of NATO and any such alliances. The current government is very close to the United States, wants US help, but there are limits to it. It's a very long-winded way to say the idea of a revived West is a bit of a myth, and also it's counterproductive.
Professor, you have documented the crisis of the US-led global liberal order, and you argue that what will come after is a multiplex world, where the West has lost his hegemony and states are not the only actors. How did you come up with that term, and what does it imply?
This is the question, the second question?
The third one.
Sorry, the third one, I'm sorry, yeah.
Because you mentioned
the yeah, already. So the idea of the multiplex world. And so if you are asking me how I came up with the idea of the multiplex world, it was in the context of writing a book that I was getting into in 2013, and to looking at the future of world order. The main provocation of writing this book, every book, like all of you, we write with a provocation. There is a purpose behind it. And what provoked me was this kind of same idea, euphoria, the triumphalism about the liberal international order. The liberal order was great, and it is done all these great things, and more importantly, it's not going to fade away. It is going to co-opt countries like China and India. Now, that argument was made by somebody who is actually a very close friend of mine. I really respect his work. John Eikenberry. His book, Liberal Leviathan. Personal friend, but completely opposite views when it comes to this. So when John published his book, Liberal Leviathan, in 2011, and I used it for my teaching, I really like his writing, I thought, there's a lot of truth to it, but this is going overboard. The liberal order was benign. It was not benign to me. I grew up in India. I didn't find a lot of benign. India was a democracy, and that time actually a much more genuine democracy than under Modi. Modi has backslided, but under Nehru and all, it was a genuine democracy. But who was India's #1 friend? Not the United States of America, the other large democracy, the liberal order, but the Soviet Union, which is always there for India, in UN resolutions, in arms transfers, and that's one reason why India is finding it really difficult to break with the Russians. So liberal order didn't benefit India. It didn't benefit China until they undertook reforms in the 1990s. Then they got the benefit, but 1990s afterwards. But these countries like India, China, much of the third world were at the receiving end of the liberal order, subject to intervention, resource exploitation. I'm not a Marxist, by the way, a leftist, but these are things that you can read if you're objective in books. And so to say that the liberal order maintained peace and stability is not true. It's a half-truth. So there was no conflict in Europe, okay, during the liberal order, the heydays, in the Cold War. 90% or over 95% of the conflicts happened in the global south. But there were plenty of war in the global south. So there was no long peace. The long peace was only in Western Europe because of the nuclear deterrence, but there was no long peace everywhere in the global south. So we have Korea, Vietnam, proxy wars like what's happening in Ukraine. We had in Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador. We had conflicts in Angola, conflicts in Somalia, Ethiopia, Yemen. I mean, everywhere you look, there are conflicts. So what kind of a peace and order we're talking about? So the liberal order was not very orderly, and it was also not very liberal because liberal meaning promoting democracy and human rights. The United States was very selective standards. It promoted democracy and human rights where he wanted, but in many parts of the world, it supported authoritarian regimes. Again, US will side against India, side with Pakistan against India. It will support Marcos in Philippines, Suharto in Indonesia. So it was not very liberal, not very orderly, and it was not very global because vast majority of countries and people in the world were not part of it. You just count India and China, two of the largest countries, between them, what, 2.5 billion, over 2.5 billion people. They're not part of the liberal order. They're not present in the creation. So that was the hype of the liberal order. The idea that the liberal order created certain institutions, interdependence, I buy that. And in fact, I'm completely a believer that economic interdependence works, it matters. The Ukraine conflict actually proves it, that economic interdependence, you can weaponize it, but that doesn't mean you escape its consequences. You know, the country that is really hurting now is Russia, but also United States. 9.1% inflation yesterday. I mean, the gas prices, so I'm sure in Western Europe something going on. So it's not like only Russia is hurting. And the Russians have a greater capacity probably to take pain, and the Americans have no capacity to take pain, which is why Biden will lose massively in the coming November election, and he's as good as finished. I supported him. I do still support him because the alternative is so much worse in the US. But anyway, the point is that was the reason why I wrote this book, End of the Liberal Order. The liberal order was neither liberal nor global nor orderly. But then how do you conceptualize the coming world order? So the simple idea that it will not have a single hegemon, the way that we had hegemony of United States. The United States were the leading power militarily and economically in the world since 1945. Those two things came together. But global hegemony, you know, through history is extremely rare. Only maybe Britain was at one point, both the strongest military power and for a short while, the largest economy, but very short while, because Germany actually was at one point a bigger economy than Britain. Now Spain, you can say, a kind of a hegemon in terms of geopolitics, but if you bring in economics and military, combine them together, no. Global hegemony is it never happens. Regional hegemony, yes. Global hegemony doesn't. The United States got to this position because of a very unique set of circumstances. Now, World War II or I doesn't happen every day. So when Europe was down and out, Germany was just, devastated, Japan was devastated. The United States was rising, might have profited from the war. It was never really vulnerable. Its own territory was really not very vulnerable except the Pearl Harbor. So United States was in a position to take over. Everything came together. But that was never going to last for very long. And in any case, it will be futile to think that the hegemony will continue. And not only that, the thing that got me most was that it will co-opt countries like China and India because they have benefited from the liberal order. Well, I actually strongly disagreed in my book, which was published in 2014, where the first multiplex idea was come about. Just because these countries have benefited from a certain type of order doesn't mean they're going to support you, because that's not how international politics works. So to think of an alternative way of thinking, so you have to think of a few, you can look around what's happening in the world. So it's a very inductive way of thinking. I actually do a lot of my conceptualization inductively, looking around and seeing what's happening and then develop a concept. So I looked around the world and say, first, I don't see global hegemony of US lasting. So China will become the #1 economy, US will remain the #1 military power. So again, we have a situation where the leading economic power is not the same as the leading military power. So it's a different kind of hegemony. There'll be multiple hegemonies, so to speak. So power will be decentralized. I saw the rise of regions. I saw that if you're living in the European Union, the EU becomes a big part of your life. It's maybe not militarily, but when it comes to economics. And climate change. So EU is a leader when it comes to climate change, maybe not necessarily in economics and military. Or when it comes to economic integration, it is a leader, and the EU doesn't necessarily see eye to eye with the US. The United States doesn't really believe in regional economic integration. If you go to study in the United States, you'll not find too many courses on regional economic integration or regionalism. Regionalism is a European thing. So just as a hegemony is an American thing. So thinking about it, different countries will provide different niche areas, so world will be decentered. China, international development. A lot of criticisms of Belt and Road Initiative, but no country spends more money, at least, on international development than China does at this moment. So leadership and power will become fragmented or shared by a number of nations. That's not hegemony. Then you look at global governance. There was a time when we talk about global governance, we talk about international organizations around the United Nations. Today, many of you study global governance would know that a lot of other actors have got into it. So we have private sector, we have corporations, foundations, civil society, social movements. Global governance has become pluralized. So it's not just those institutions that are created by the US and its allies after World War II. Then you look at ideas. The ideas are also fragmenting or becoming more pluralistic. So when Francis Fukuyama said end of history, he sold a lot of books, but very few people believe that. I wrote an article now in New York Times that this is in 2001 or 2. It's just nonsense. It's not going to happen. So now we know that there are good ideas, bad ideas. There is liberalism. There is liberalism has variants. Social democracy in Europe is different from the capitalist democracy of the United States. Then there is some different populism is here as an ideology. There is extremism that is driving certain states. So there are different types of ideologies that are going to compete with each other, as they have always done. There is not going to be a singular ideology. So then the number of actors, not just in global governance, but also in different, in every part of the world. It's, if you look at the 19th century world, it was pretty much a state-centric world, big power-centric world, the concert of Europe, for example. But then you come to 20th century, the concert principle was enshrined in the UN Charter. The P5 is basically based on that. But now look at the number of actors. Again, you have states, non-state actors, you have international institutions. Back in the 19th century, you only had, again, the European Concert, Universal Postal Union, and the like. But now, so many institutions, regional institutions, multi-level governance. So that is complexity. That is multiplicity, hence multiplex. decentered, post-hegemonic, no hegemon, where the actors that produce order or disorder are not just states, but a whole bunch of other actors operating at different levels. I did have one other inspiration, which may sound trivial to you, and I have been criticized for doing that, but I'm glad I did that. And that was that I took the immediate context from cinema, multiplex cinema. Now, again, I developed this concept inductively by looking at what's happening in the world. But if I were to create a term for it, I could have called it post-Western or non-Western. I don't like post, because I don't think West has disappeared. West is still an actor. It's just that we should not be talking too much about it. But there is going to be a certain type of Western identity, or even non-Western, it's negative. So I thought it'll be good to find a term that captures multiplicity, complexity, but also kind of resonates with people, sells a little better. And multiplex is the idea of a cinema where you could actually see in a single complex many different movies under the same roof. You're not in the old days, you go to the cinema, you saw a movie, then you have to wait until that movie has run its course for the next movie to come. That's how I grew up watching a cinema. Multiplex is a Canadian invention, by the way. And it started in Toronto in the 50s, and now very common. Now there is streaming, there is Netflix. You can have multiplex at home. So the whole idea is the audience have a choice of what they see. Choice of scripts, producers, directors, and actors. So they're not beholden to only one type of theater, or one type of cinema. Now people say, and again, I get criticized for saying this, that hey, so what? Hollywood films are still dominant. Okay, everybody watches Hollywood. It's not that simple. I didn't watch a Hollywood film until I was 25 years old. I watched Bollywood. In Asia, there is Chinese films, Hong Kong movies. Now, it is true that Hollywood is dominant, but its dominance is declining. China is actually increasingly producing more and more market share of movies. And Hollywood is trying to adapt to becoming more multicultural from being because Hollywood's market, Hollywood makes more money outside of US than inside US. In fact, China is where a lot of the money is made by Hollywood films. So they have to cater to the local taste too. They localize. And there are all sorts of cultural products coming up from Korea, Taiwan, Japan, which are actually more popular than the United States, American produce. So there is a cultural diffusion that also resonates with the idea of power diffusion, or the global shift in economic power. So that's what I was trying to capture, using the term multiplex as a metaphor, not as a theory, but to capture the diversity, the decentering of the world, the complexity of the world, the post-hegemonic nature of the world, and the kind of pluralization of leadership and governance.
Let's hope that you will sell more books than Fukuyama this time then. So you don't buy then the idea of a multipolar world?
But the same reason I said, multipolarity is a 19th century European term, maybe 18th century, okay? When you have a bunch of powers, Spain, France, Great Britain, Russia, and Austria, Hungary, Prussia. So it came from Europe. A lot of international relations concepts come from Western Europe. Now, the problem is that those concepts they're not timeless. They're time specific. And they don't necessarily travel to other parts of the world, in other time zones or other time periods. So what is the main feature of multipolarity? First, great powers. You have to have 3 or more great powers. But the entities that call the shots are great powers. Poland cannot be a part of a multipolar system. Poland was always the victim, by the way. So it is the great powers, the concept of Europe. concert, by definition, is a great power club. The other thing is these are states. Great powers, and these are states. They're not non-state actors. And also, going back to the context in which multipolarity came about, Europe in the 19th century, there was economic interdependence, but that was very superficial. People always say, oh, interdependence did not prevent World War I, World War II. Well, yes, it didn't, but today's economic interdependence is a bit different. It is based not just on trade, but has many other dimensions, including production networks, supply chains, which is what is biting us now. So it's much more difficult to break. So that's why the 19th century concept of multipolarity, simply by counting the number of powers, more than 3 powers, which are great powers, calling the shots, and having a very strategic interaction, forgetting about the deeper economic interdependence, that didn't seem to me an appropriate term for the 21st century. That's why I thought multipolar is very common, by the way. The French have always loved multipolarity because it brings them to the table in the bipolar world. When they were a bipolar world, French talked about multipolarity. The Chinese love to talk about multipolarity, although they've stopped doing that now. Because Russians love multipolarity when they were sidelined. So all these great powers, when they feel left out, they talk about multipolarity because that brings them a pole. Now, I don't think European Union uses multipolarity in the same way. And there are a lot of other entities. Regional powers may be better. But the term has survived because we are still beholden to certain old concepts. It's very hard to get rid of them. And the elite, the strategic intellectual elite in certain countries, they feel validated, empowered by multipolarity. And international relations literature has not really adapted to 21st century realities to the extent we would hope it to.
So how did the pandemic accelerate these trends you were talking about?
Talking about the pandemic? Well, the pandemic, you have heard a lot about the pandemic, and I don't know how much more I can say, but I think there are some good news, and there are, of course, the bad news. The bad news is that, so many people died, and some of them could have been preventable. I strongly believe half of the deaths, or more than half of the deaths in the United States, could have been prevented. The most powerful country in the world is also the scene of the greatest number of deaths from the pandemic. It is really a supreme tragic irony. So a lot of people died, and some of them would have been avoidable. A lot of them were avoidable. China's role was also very questionable, in fact, the Chinese still are not being completely transparent about what happened. I really don't think, unlike other people, China could have stopped the pandemic in Wuhan. They would not have, because this virus is very different from other viruses. But had they been more forthcoming, had they allowed a genuine international mission to come into China, and they realized that certain basic scientific data, realized how transmissible, how dangerous this is, I think the international community would have been better prepared. Because China was the place of the first outbreak, even if there's conspiracy theories saying that, oh, China was not the first place, we have no proof, it came from outside, maybe came through air transport, freight, good supplies. Generally, the only evidence we have that the first major outbreak happened in Wuhan and then spread. They may not have completely stopped it, they could have limited it, but it would have been really nice, the trust-building exercise, to share their information rather than deny it. And this is not a complaint from people from outside. This is a complaint from people of Wuhan who died. A lot of people there died, a lot of the media also got persecuted. Then China did extremely well. It protected its people, it provided vaccines for which it deserves our praise, but still, we still don't know a lot about how the virus originated because China still continues not to reveal, not to give access to the information it has. The United States did a terrible thing. Trump basically called it China virus, then he denied it, it's like flu, which maybe it is becoming, Trump may be getting right now, it is becoming like flu in the US at least, because of the medicines and vaccine. But it was not a great success advertisement for the two leading powers of the world. So that's the bad news. We don't have trust in the leadership of either US or China when it comes to a pandemic situation like this. But what's the good news? The good news is that the vaccines were developed at a record speed. And I have some statistics that will tell you, this is one of the fastest vaccines ever developed against a major pandemic. There's only one other, mumps or something, the vaccine came a bit earlier. But within 1 year, we had a vaccine. And the scientific community and the medical industry deserves a lot of praise. A lot more people would have died. Maybe hundreds of millions of people would have died, like what happened in 1919. So that's good news. And the other good news is that in a ironic way, it proves that economic interdependence matters. You cannot break it. Just now, Ukraine is also disproving the view that economic interdependence doesn't matter, it matters. It shows that the world is interlinked. No country is safe unless everybody else is safe. Ironically, China is still holding on to the zero COVID policy. And I can tell you that the Chinese, many Chinese are not very happy with it. They just can't protest. They can't say anything against their government. But that's a different story. That's the bad. That's kind of the sort of bad news that so many people died. Things could have been better managed. There could have been better leadership, including by WHO, by states. But the good news is the vaccines were developed. The vaccines, of course, took time to distribute, so it is, it starkly exposes the divide between the rich and the poor countries. So people like me have taken 4 vaccines. I can bet there are people in parts of Africa who haven't taken one, or if I've taken one, not the best shots. Now, being in the United States, the vaccine, they actually give you away. You take a vaccine, you get a beer free. So at one point, our state government of Maryland, where I live, was actually having lottery tickets. You take a vaccine, you get a free lottery ticket. And I have picked up beer and vegetables going for vaccines because it's kind of become like that. But just compare that to the despair, the abject despair of people who are dying and not getting a single shot. Now that is a cruel irony at the heart of the current global order. And that, to me, is a major implication of a major legacy of COVID. Hopefully, the situation is getting better, and vaccines are more and more available, and we have more medicine to counter this, the virus, but we're not out of the woods yet. And in terms of world order, what it told me is that you don't trust either the United States or China to lead the world. Find a third way. I wrote an article for Council on Foreign Relations, a third way for world order. Because when it comes to leading a major world, these countries are going to fight with each other, compete with each other, and forget about the rest of the world. So just in the Cold War, there was a non-aligned movement, a third way. I think regional organizations, regional cooperation, and other types of coalitions, health coalitions, are very important rather than relying on the United States and China. Having given credit to the US for its scientists doing an absolutely brilliant job developing the best vaccines that are out there. But again, that's a multicultural thing. A lot of the people involved in those vaccines are actually came from, as immigrants or outsiders working there. But still, the United States brought them together. China did a great job protecting its people later on. So give them some credit, but I will not trust them. That's my biggest lesson from the pandemic.
Thank you. So how do you see the role of Europe in this multiplex world?
I don't know. It's a very difficult time to say that because I think you all know that because of Ukraine, Europe is more under the influence of the United States. I mean, when we talk about Europe, you talk about the European Union. So Europe has become more and more dependent on the US for energy, for military security for sure, and who knows, for in other areas too. So the European Union as a group was a big element for me of the multiplex world because one element of multiplexity is regionalism, regional centers. And the European Union as a center, regional center for economic management, regulation, health, and culture actually exemplified the shift towards multiplexity. And we had similar trends in Southeast Asia, similar trends in, to some extent in Africa. But now the European Union is, at least until we have clarity on the Ukraine situation, looks like more under the US. So rise of the West and all this, euphoria coming up, global NATO. So the European contribution to multiplexity is weakened now. By the way, in 2014 or 2015, the European Institute of Strategic Studies, EU Institute of Strategic Study in Paris, actually published a paper called European Union in the Multiplex World, which I thought was fascinating. That was supposed to be part of the blueprint for the European Union, creating, of course, European Union always had economic autonomy, economic governance. It had increasingly kind of regulations against internet and information technology. And in term, I would anticipate the European Union reasserting certain amount of autonomy rather than becoming a strategic appendage to the United States. By the way, there is irony at the heart of Europe. Most NATO members are members of European Union, and most European Union members are members of NATO. Now, I pointed out this in my 2013-14 book. So you can have your cake and eat it too. So when it comes to European Union being a normative power, you go through the European Union. When you want to play the geopolitical card, you go through NATO. Now, at some point, there will be a contradiction. And there was a contradiction, which is why, while the European Union did some really good things normatively in terms of peace building, humanitarian action, selling its model of economic integration, but people in the global south are skeptical because they think these are still the ex-colonial powers. They're still members of NATO. So you have a kind of a dual identity or a split personality, multiple personality disorder maybe, and Europe has not been able to overcome that, and that will become a bit worse. Having said that, I think Europe should continue to do what it does best, climate change, regulation in a way to increase welfare. The biggest achievement of the European Union itself has been to increase people's welfare. The biggest setback to the European Union now, when it comes to multiplex world, is that war has returned to the heart of Europe. Now, I don't know, you know about this in 1990s, when people are talking about Europe, they're not just talking about the European Union as a security community. They're talking about European common house. Europe that is united at peace with itself. The Palmer Commission, common security, that idea has gone through the window. The major war has returned to the heart of Europe. And it's not just, although it's a very unfair thing to say, that Ukraine is somehow special compared to, say, Kosovo Bosnia. But I think people in Europe do think Ukraine as a special thing. Like it's more a European problem, European identity, which is why Ukrainian refugees are more readily accepted in Western Europe, partly because it's also neighbor, but partly because of this identity thing, than, say, refugees from Africa. So because of that, Ukraine cannot be delinked from Europe. And we have a war at the heart of Europe. And it's a proxy war, but it's not, it is closest to being an actual shooting war. You have proxy wars in, say, Nicaragua or Afghanistan. It was so far away from Europe, okay? So NATO can get involved here and there, but it's not going to hit NATO at home. This war will, if it is not controlled. And the way things are going, expansion of NATO, is surrounding a very angry, dissatisfied major power with an alliance on many different sides. Then the question of supply of ever-increasing weapons, and also, who knows? It's a matter of time before somebody will find out that the Americans are fighting inside Ukraine. I mean, now they're fighting as volunteers. But I think, it has happened before. American allies have fought in proxy wars in the Cold War. So you will probably find that the United States is directly involved in some way. And then that will create counter reaction from Russia. So this is the war that's going, and who is going to be the victim of this? It will be Europe. The war is in Europe. It's not in the United States. It's not in China. It's not in the Middle East. It is in Europe. And that is a more significant outcome of the Ukraine conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict.
So I open the floor to the audience. Who's going to ask? Tenim micro? Tenim micro de mà o...?
I'm looking at the time.
Sí? Gràcies. Un segon. Who else after? 1, 2, okay. 3. You want...
So we have questions now?
Yes, we have 3 questions
yeah,
now.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, sure.
You want me to pick up some questions
Yeah.
together?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. So here first.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Acharya, Valeria Bello, professor at the Blanquerna University Ramon Llull. So thank you very much also for accepting this invitation to come here in Barcelona, and thank you so much for such an excellent and inspiring talk. So my question, I would go straight to the point, because I guess there are so many questions. You've mentioned the military hegemony of the US and China's economic hegemony and the role they play in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So my question is, what about the cultural hegemony? So is there any cultural hegemony, and can this be global? Because the other two are not, as you say. And can this be global? And what could we find that in perhaps those non-state actors that you mentioned before, the private system and private actors that today sometimes play much bigger role than states themselves? And what is then the role of this cultural hegemony on the conflict between these two states?
Just to clarify, cultural hegemony.
Yes.
Yeah, I got that, yeah.
Go ahead. Yes, I think it's easier, yeah.
Okay. Cultural hegemony is, it's different from economic or military hegemony, although it's kind of linked as well. The term culture is very complicated. It's sometimes too broad. So there is, of course, culture based on traditional values, religion is part of culture, but there is also culture based on cultural products, movies and songs and theater and literature. So when it comes to, when people talk about cultural hegemony as identifiable force, something that one can measure, one can see working its way to influence people in other parts of the world, I think generally people think of movies and songs and music, cultural products. I don't think anybody seriously thinks about values, like basic values. Those values, of course, have been contested, so-called liberal values versus illiberal values. And the idea that democracy and human rights are, Western values, which have no resonance in the rest of the world, is very controversial. I mean, there's no question that the Western countries domestically imbibe democracy and human rights, internalize it as their values to a much greater extent than it is in the global South. There is no question about it. That doesn't mean that these values are typically Western. They had no basis, no origins in other civilizations. So maybe at this point of history, the West has done a better job of internalizing it. I tend to think of at least human dignity as a universal value. Democracy is not. Democracy is never been universal. By the way, democracy is one of the least successful political institutions in the world history. If you look at 5,000 years, which is, I'm writing a book about this, 5,000 years of world order, divine monarchy is actually the most successful and durable political institution. Republic, not democracy, is another very successful political institution. Democracy isn't. But human rights, especially in the broad sense, which is protecting the dignity of the individual, the idea that the state should not kill its own people and should actually respect the rights of the citizens, is actually not very Western. It has various points of origin in other civilizations. But that is, at the moment, the West offers the best example of domestic institutions to protect human rights. There's no question about it. So, in that sense, these Western ideas, if that is part of your culture, that's what you're talking about, there has always been a cultural fault line in the global order. When you talk about culture in the sense of cultural products, entertainment, movies, songs, as I was mentioning, those types of cultures have been globalized. There is a globalization of culture. And there's no question that whether it is consumer products or fast food or drinks like Coca-Cola or Hollywood movies, they have been a big part of American soft power and Western soft power. But that is beginning to change, and increasingly you will find, and it's also regional, by the way. So there's a very strong regional dimension to cultural diffusion. So if you go to East Asia, you will find that Korean dramas are actually extremely popular, even in China, more than Hollywood sitcoms or American sitcoms. In Southeast Asia, Bollywood, Hindi films are very popular in Southeast Asia and also in Pakistan. Nigeria is a big producer of movies as well. And also, that sort of culture always has a strong national basis. And increasingly, China is going to produce its own movies and more. So the cultural dominance of the West based on popular culture, cultural products, which was once concentrated in the West, is now becoming more diffuse, in keeping with this idea of the multiplex world. And whether that makes the world a better or worse place, I have always felt that diversity is a good thing because, first of all, it's more interesting. If everybody ate the same food or spoke the same language, life will be boring. But also, while diversity, cultural diversity can create conflict, it also creates the desire to know each other better and learn each other better. So diversity is actually an invitation to learn about other cultures. When you are confronted with diversity, you actually find that it makes you humble. Give you an example of ancient China. Ancient China, when the Chinese state emerged during the Zhou dynasty, they had no idea of anybody out there. except Chinese. So China was the Middle Kingdom. Only the immediate periphery was barbarians. But they didn't know about India, they didn't know about Roman Empire, they didn't know about Greece. But as the Silk Road brought ideas about other cultures, and they said, there is a Roman Empire, there is India, the Chinese actually maintained the pretense of the Middle Kingdom, but they started respecting the outside world, that, hey, there are civilizations which are really out there. They still use the terms barbarian, but the policies were very different towards India and the Roman Empire than towards, the Mongols or the Proto-Mongols. So I think cultural diversity creates interaction and respect. And there is also many examples of peaceful diffusion of culture. We think of class of civilizations, but a lot of times ideas, innovations, even religious spread, which sometimes comes with violence, but there's many examples of cultural diffusion which is entirely peaceful. And ideas travel in a very peaceful way without fighting. In the coming world, I think it'll be a multicultural world, multi-civilizational world. No single civilization will dominate the way Western civilization has dominated the world for the last 200 years or so. So you think there will be conflict? One might think, and there may be, but I actually think conflict is only going to happen where there is a convergence, there is a coincidence of cultural difference plus economic inequality. If those two things actually coincide, that's when conflict happens. Culture by itself doesn't create conflict. It's when it is combined with economic inequality, both within and between states. That's when that leads to conflict. Cultural familiarity, cultural diversity by itself doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. In fact, it can create cooperation, understanding, and make the world a more interesting place. And it is something which is real, by the way. You are never going to make the world a global village. Cultural diversity is a fact of life, so we have to live with it.
Thank you, Professor Acharya, for your participation so far. My name is Rafael. I'm a PhD candidate in international relations at the University of Brasilia in Brazil. I'm going to try to contextualize my question so it's a little bit clearer. First, in a quick response to your comment about there not being a liberal global order. I think that we can think that there was if we reduce our understanding of humanity to circumscribe the West, the countries in the West, meaning Europe, United States, Canada, so on and so forth. And because I think that there is this circumscription and a lot of understanding, maybe subconscious understanding of how the world is, right, within the West. And this takes me back to my country, Brazil. We have our own particular type of racism that's as shameful, as abhorrent as any type of racism. And in our context, we speak a lot of selective indignation, right? It's when we, members of society, are upset when tragedy strikes one part of the population, but not when it strikes another part of the population. When whites in Brazil are affected, upper middle class whites in Brazil are affected, but the poor or even the black population, the brown population is affected, right? So a common commentary in Brazil regards that, the reaction to Ukraine as selective indignation on the West, right? Because we look at Iraq, we look at Afghanistan, and we didn't see the same indignation from Western societies. And so, in regards to your comments as recognizing a common identity of Europeans with Ukraine, I want to ask you if there might be something beyond the common identity, something beyond economic repercussions or economic concerns, beyond geopolitical concerns, in recognizing more humanity in Ukrainians than we recognize in Iraqis and Afghanis and other peoples of the third world. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I got the total gist of your question, but let me focus on this term identity, common identity. If your question is if there is something beyond just this common identity that can hold countries together, could you just put it very succinctly that what you want me to answer? And also there's a light, I can see your face very well because of the light. Specifically repeat the question.
So my concern is more regarding my proposition that it has maybe more to do with the selective indignation that I was speaking of, with not recognizing humanity and other peoples. So if we look at Ukrainians from a European perspective, from a Western perspective, because the United States did the same, so we're upset, more upset with what's happening in Ukraine because we recognize Ukrainians as human, whereas we are not as upset. I'm saying we as a Western society. So Western societies are less upset with what happens and with such interventions in third world countries in the global south.
I got that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Well, that is actually very much part of the debate and discourse now. So this is one reason why many global south countries do not entirely buy or support the policies of the NATO countries and the United States. Now, there is no question that most global south countries do not support the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is an invasion. There's no other way to put it. And until now, more Ukrainians have died and suffered than Russians or anybody else. I mean, if you bring in the civilian population and the damage. So most global south countries get it, which is why they voted overwhelmingly in the UN General Assembly resolution against Russia. But that doesn't mean they support Western actions or they want to buy into the expanded Western, revived Western order. But two very different things. And because they see double standards. So why Ukraine gets so much attention and what's happening in, say, Ethiopia or Yemen, where there is, people have died in hundreds of thousands. What about Afghanistan, Iraq? I mean, Iraq, the number of people, I think I have some statistics, and much more than people who have died in Ukraine. And that resulted from an unilateral, non-UN authorized invasion by the United States of a sovereign country on false pretexts. There was no nuclear weapons, there was no evidence of that. So yes, those are things that always stays in the back of the, third world or global south countries when they assess, when they look at the Ukraine situation. And more than that, they see, and global south is a very large entity, so we cannot generalize about the global south. There is a very rich global south, there is poor global south, and then there are American allies like Singapore, which is not a very rich country, but sees itself as part of the non-Western bloc when it comes to human rights and democracy. But I have just a general sense, they see double standards, they see, West had done similar things before. I mean, how many countries, including in Europe, imposed sanctions on the US when the US invaded Iraq? And it was not just a Saddam Hussein regime being toppled. It's the millions and millions of Iraqis that died as a consequence of the war. What sanctions were there on the US? So those are the kind of things people remember. Refugees, now you have to understand that Ukraine is in Europe. Historically, refugees tend to go to the neighboring states. The same in Turkey, same in India got millions of refugees when the East Pakistan, Pakistan army descended on East Pakistan, leading to major war, a lot of killings, and India received millions and millions of refugees from now what is Bangladesh. So neighbors always end up getting the large share of refugees. But even then, the differential treatment between refugees coming from Ukraine and refugees coming from, say, Central America in the United States is palpable. I mean, there is a documentary where a journalist visited in California a camp of Ukrainian refugees and a camp of Latino refugees, and wrote a report, a documentary on this. It's just dramatically different. The way, the facilities, the treatment, the political climate. Okay, so that rankles a lot of global South countries. But there is another point, I'd like to put that on the table. For many global South countries, this is a European problem. This is not their business. Europe, NATO created this problem, and Russia is a part of it. But the whole world is being asked to pay a price, having to choose sides. If you don't join our sanctions, you will be targeted. So the world is being asked to pay a price for which essentially it's Europe's problem. That's what India's former national security advisor recently said in a foreign affairs TV interview, that this is not, a lot of countries in the outside, they don't see their problem. They didn't create it. Why do they have to pay a price for it? So that's another side to it. Then there is the side effects of the war, like food prices, energy scarcity. It's going to disproportionately affect the global South countries, even though it's affecting all of us. Here in Europe, in the United States, in Russia, but it is disproportionately going to affect global South countries. Then there is the memory of, we are back to the future. The Cold War is back again. NATO is back again. So a lot of people in the global South also don't like that. So there is therefore a reluctance to buy into the Western logic beyond the fact that Russians have committed aggression and it's not good for anybody, because a major principle has been violated. In fact, I see something good coming out of this because of the consensus in the world now, more or less, including in India and China, by the way, if you read between the lines, that the Russians have violated an international norm. They have violated, there is no, and that strengthens the norm in my view, because it makes it difficult for other countries to look at the consequences. And now, the conflict also shows economic interdependence actually matters. It goes both ways. Some good things have come about international order, and that's why I don't think the international order will be completely destroyed by this, because it paradoxically reinforces some of the core ideas of international order. But in the meantime, the point you were making is the differential treatment of the same people, same humanity, but one group of people getting better treatment, there are double standards, is really what is at the heart of the global implications of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is seen as a European conflict. The rest of the world has nothing to do with it, but is being paid to price. Even people can go further, and they would say, and I'm in Europe, I'm very conscious of this fact, and I'm being deliberately provocative, that, hey, Europe is back to the future. That's what they used to do. They used to fight among each other. They had First World War. They had Second World War. There's actually been statistics that probably the largest number of wars in the medieval period, early modern period, happened in Europe, not in Asia, other parts of the world. And Europeans are doing this again. There we go. That kind of perception is happening. But to me personally, what is really sad, and I take it personally because I have been a big fan of the European Union and its ability to overcome war, that has been severely damaged. the credentials of Europe as a normative model for the rest of the world. Nobody is going to take Europe as a model of peace anymore, because of the way this has been basically militarization, inability to manage a conflict, probably self-fulfilling prophecy, despite many, many very smart geopolitical leaders saying NATO expansion would be a mistake. George F. Kennan, I'm sure you know, the father of containment, said NATO expansion is the biggest blunder of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War era. Henry Kissinger said, the current CIA director, William Burns, he said, even tempting Ukraine to join NATO is the biggest red line you can have for Russia. Now, I am very much aware of the alternative argument that Putin was always evil, Putin always wanted to bring back the Soviet Union, you're just finding an excuse. I think that's also another extreme. The real story is it's a bit of both. That the NATO expansion was a provocation? Well, the Pope said it. I mean, in not so many words, but implying that there was provocation. To me, this conflict would have been avoided if people have been more humanity-oriented rather than geopolitically oriented. And right now, the saddest thing is it undermines the credibility of Europe as kind of a third force between China and the United States in providing a model for stability and prosperity. That to me that is the saddest legacy of no matter how this conflict ends.
We have some minutes left. I will ask CCCB people to allow us 10 minutes more if possible. Yes? Then I have one question there, and what I'm suggesting, if you agree, is the other one who wants to raise questions, just line up here because we will save time with a microphone going around the room, okay? And then I can see how many people is willing to speak. While she's asking the question, the rest, please make a line together.
I might be able to hear better if you're closer.
If you don't mind. Allà, el micro. El micro era allà, no. Bueno, el micro per ella, per començar.
Per allà?
Sí, aquella noia, de l'última fila. And the rest, just please wait here. We'll take all the questions together, okay?
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. It's really an honor to see you speak today, and I've been following your work for years, so it's very exciting. My question is about a comment you made during the talk today about how you're not a leftist. And of course, I understand how and why you make that decision and through your writings. But I kind of wanted to get your perspective on why you don't cross the boundary over to leftism, if that makes sense. I'd love to.
No, I could not quite get it. It's about why I decided to.
Well, you were saying that how you're not a leftist, and of course, through reading your work, I understand how and why, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that a little bit.
Why you are not a leftist? This is the question,
I'm
no?
not a leftist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your microphone.
Right. Maybe, a lot depends on your teachers, who teaches you. Now, ironically, I studied in one of the most left-wing universities in the world, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Half of my professors are card-carrying members of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. And I did my master's there in India. They were actually serving members of the Indian Communist Orthodox. Of course, it's a very different thing, but they are communists. And intellectually fascinating. Then I taught at York University, Toronto, where Socialist Register is still being edited. Robert Cox and Leo Panich both died, but they were great friends, colleagues. I respected them. Why I did not become a leftist? It all depends on the meaning of what is a left. My university, American University, some people accuse it of being left of the center. What is left of the center in the United States is probably right wing in India. So it's all relative. I am very liberal, which to a lot of people think of leftist. Like John Mearsheimer thinks constructivists are leftists. Now, if you know John Mearsheimer, the realist scholar, he said, okay, you constructivists, they were leftists. Okay, so it all depends. Your leftist is not the same as my leftist. I am certainly very liberal when it comes to domestic issues. So that's why I'm a big supporter of President Biden and the Democrats. But when it comes to international issues, I maintain my own position. I'm a critique of the liberal international order, and I just don't want to be bogged down with an ideological identification. So if you look at a left-wing ideology, like opposing military intervention, exploitation of resources in the global south, these are standard ideologies, platforms of the left. I buy that. Racism, anti-racism, I buy that. But I also believe that they should not be confined to only, they should not be the monopoly or prerogative of left-wing thinkers. So I took on this idea of race in my latest article, not latest, second latest, Race and Racism in the Making of the Modern World Order, International Affairs, still freely available. Because it used to be the preserve of post-colonial scholars. My idea was that everybody should be talking about it. It's the moment you say this is a leftist position, other people would say, okay, ignore it. I wanted to globalize it. I said race and racism is the concern of everybody, not just of the rest. Colonialism is the concern of everybody, not just of the left. So that's why I developed this idea of global IR. The global IR is inclusive as long as it sort of relates to the experience of the entire humankind, whether left or the right. We can be a realist or a liberal or a Marxist, but still do global IR. Another thing I believe in, again in that agenda, my foreign affairs article just came out, which basically argues that countries that discriminate against women, lower income people, races who engage in racial discrimination and religious discrimination lose out in the end. So I call it the power within. That countries that actually, at least in the coming future, that manage the social cleavages and reduce discrimination on the basis of class, gender, race, and religious difference, if they reduce the discrimination, they will do better in the future. So what do you think? Is it left or right or liberal? I don't know. Foreign Affairs is not a left magazine. It's very much mainstream. And they invited me to write something on this, reading my race article. That's the thing I'm trying to do. To answer your question, I did not want to get bogged down with being left or right. I wanted to have an inclusive global perspective rather than engaging in a conversation with the like-minded. You can always be part of a group and say the same thing to each other. I wanted to say the same thing to people who don't buy my line, but try to persuade them. So it's maybe a pedagogical or epistemological strategy rather than an ideology. And maybe I'm not very ideologically minded that way. The idea is to get something done and promote some ideas. And sometimes being branded one way or the other can actually deter you from doing that. But nobody has asked me this question, so you're the first one. Thank you very much. I will think about it, and if you stay in touch with me, I may come up with a much better answer.
Maybe you could write an article on that, why I'm not a leftist. Yeah. So I will pick up the last three questions all together, okay? I remind you that Professor flew from Washington last night, so he must be very tired.
No, it's okay.
But he's in good shape, as you can see. So we take the three together, please.
Yeah.
Good evening, Professor Acharya. My name is Praveen. I'm a PhD student from India. First question, my question is basically that we have seen economic interdependence has had very positive impacts on global peace pre-pandemic era. So
can you repeat that? I missed that. You're from India and you're doing a PhD?
Yes, sir.
And?
I'm asking the question. The question is about economic interdependence and its impact on global order in the pre-pandemic level era. So post-pandemic, we have seen that most of the countries are shifting their global value chains to allies or to their shores, basically domesticating the production chains. So how do you see the world order post-pandemic, because the production chains are being shifted to allies, and the economic interdependence, the positive value that it had, will not be playing the same role, especially with context to emerging powers like China. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I'll write that down. Yeah. The next question? Yeah. Are you ready? Yeah.
Well, good evening, Prof. Acharya. Thank you for the insightful presentation. My name is Gabriel. I am a postdoc researcher on international studies. And my question would be related to, you were mentioning that global hegemony is very rare. And then the scenario could be that US will keep as a military power while not an economic power, that this place would be taken by China. And so my question would be, how you see in terms of global governance, this is going to be something shared, or what's your take on this? Thank you so much.
Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for your words. My question relates to your point that you made at the beginning of the debate.
Sorry, can you speak up a little?
My question has to do with the claim that you were making at the initial part of the debate regarding the disruption or the falling apart of Europe, and the fact that the divides that characterize Europe may get deeper and deeper. Does this reminded me a lot of the debates that revolve around the anarchy problematic, and how certain schools of thought, then the realist and the neoliberal school of thought, make this claim of a singularity of logics of anarchy, implying the inability of states to learn from each other, and the possibility toward, thanks to social interaction among states, to learn from each other and have a better picture of the social actor that the other is. So my question is, does your claim on the disruption of Europe imply that European states or the actors that play in the scene of Europe, they do not learn, do not have the ability to learn from each other? And this question goes towards the fact that, or the second question on what is it exactly that is a bad idea, as you were saying at the beginning, global NATO, or the global sprouting of security communities, or communities of institutions of identity, in which states, as I was mentioning before, thanks to social interaction, have some sort of a clear image of what the other social actor is. How to say, is it a bad idea for the sprout of such institutions of identity, let's put it this way, that may take the form of security communities such as NATO? Would this allow for the even if even if it's separated, not universal, but wouldn't this allow for the international community to come together? I hope I'm clear to some extent.
Okay, so there was a lot of stuff in the last question, but could I just answer the idea of social interactions and NATO as a security community?
Sorry, your microphone.
Could I focus on the later part of your question of NATO as a security community, and how could it be different through social interaction? Would that be a good way to answer your question? Because
Yes, I believe so.
okay.
But
Thank you, thank you. All right, so the first question about interdependence, supply chains. Those of you who are students of international relations will know this, that there's been a long-standing argument from the liberals, not liberals like domestic liberals. You know, liberals in the US means people who support abortion and the like. But I'm talking about liberal theory of international relations. Says that economic interdependence is good for peace. However, it never said economic interdependence creates peace. The theory simply said that economic interdependence increases the cost of war. So that makes countries be careful when they go to war. So this is much misunderstood. Liberal theory never said economic interdependence can create peace. It simply increases the cost of war. So that might create conditions for peace. It's an indirect logic, not a direct correlation. But having said that, this has been quite powerful, and one of the liberal arguments that has withstood the test of time. You could say, without too much exaggeration, that the only reason why US and China did not fight a war is because of economic interdependence. Nuclear weapons, maybe, but China, until recently, was not on nuclear parity, maybe still now, that there was so much economic interdependence. This is why East Asia has avoided war for such a long time, despite much prediction of war in the region. However, COVID-19 and now Ukraine has dealt a blow to it. And as the question, the person who asked the question pointed out, that it has really created doubts about economic interdependence. Now, there has been some arguments that economic interdependence doesn't matter because it can be weaponized. So countries use economic interdependence to hurt each other, not to build trust or cooperation. So US and China, US using economic sanctions to hurt its adversaries. Even with countries, it has economic interdependence, knowing that it will hurt that country more because it is interdependent. China is doing the same thing to Taiwan. You know, Taiwan is invested a lot in China, in mainland China, but now it has become a vulnerability because China is now has the upper hand and it is threatening Taiwan. So weaponizing economic interdependence. My argument is I don't buy that. As an IR theorist myself, actually I think, paradoxically, this supply chain crisis, all this actually proves the point. I made that point earlier, that economic interdependence matters. You can weaponize economic interdependence. That's what the West did towards Russia. They imposed the most comprehensive economic sanctions ever imposed on a country, at least in recent memory. But who is hurting? Russia is hurting. But the relative hurt is relative, okay? Hurt is relative to your capacity to take pain. Now, in my view, Russian capacity to take pain is much greater than the Western capacity to take pain. And the West is hurting really badly, and it's not a short-term thing. It's not just going to go away until the war ends. Nobody is interested in peace. They're interested in hurting each other now. That's what another thing that the Brazilian presidential candidate Lula said, that nobody is interested in peace. The UN is marginalized. The UN Secretary General, who could have done more, is completely sidelined. In previous conflicts, Hammarskjöld, UTAN, they actually, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they actually were flying in between countries and doing things. Nothing is happening now. Peace is not happening, so countries are hurting, both sides are hurting until the war is over. So to me, the economic, even though, and you're talking about another thing, that countries will become more self-reliant, okay? They'll be autarkic, back to the medieval times when you have mercantilism. I don't see that happening. I don't really see that happening. What is happening is, though, the hype about globalization, the World Economic Forum kind of globalization. Here I'm the leftist. This is that kind of hype about a bunch of capitalist elites sitting there thinking that they have figured it out. The same World Economic Forum recently said, oh, globalization creates inequalities. Where were you the last 20 years when others have been saying that? So that hype is diminished and have been challenged, which is very good. But that doesn't mean globalization is over. The key element of multiplex world is that there will be diversity, but still interdependence. And that interdependence doesn't have to be super interdependence, like a global village. But countries are going to still depend on each other. And we're not going to go back to mercantilism, and we're not going to go back to the national self-reliance and autarky. Supply chain disruptions are real, but they can be reversed. In fact, they had already been reversed, by the way. Do you know that world trade rebounded back to even higher than the pre-2019 level, just 2021?
Professor, we really need to summarize because we are out of time. So you have 2 more questions left, but please be short.
2 more questions quickly. The share of economic and security disjuncture, China being economically more powerful, US being militarily more powerful, how this will affect global order? Well, it will mean there will be no global hegemony. No single country can be in the same position as the US was after World War II. And that's what I've been talking about. Now, whether it's good or bad for world order is a very normative question. If you think the US dominance from 1945 was a great thing for the world, then you think this will be bad. I didn't think it was really great for a lot of countries in the world. The liberal international order was a club. It was a privileged club of the West, like a very expensive golf club. You have to be a member, you have to be introduced by somebody, you have to wait for 5 years, you have to do all these reforms or credentials, then you become it. That's what the liberal international order was, a club of the West. It was not a universal sort of a membership association, which is why it may be good, may be bad. Some people might think a reformed liberal international order, which is truly inclusive, less club-like, may be a good thing. Or we think of something else, like in keeping with the diversity and the rise of the rest, those realities, you can actually devise a better international order. In terms of the last question, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get all of it, but I see that we're talking about social interaction, identity, and I think one of the questions we should really need to ponder over is what kind of community, what kind of club, what kind of association the world needs. I am a strong believer in regionalism, including the type the European Union built up to a point. The European model doesn't apply to the rest of the world in most cases, but it did extremely well in Europe. But maybe it has become too regulatory. But still, I believe such institutions do good. NATO type of institutions don't. And I make a strong distinction between NATO and the European Union. NATO was never a security community. NATO is a military alliance. You know, IR 101. There's a difference between collective security and collective defense. Now, when people started talking about NATO identity, NATO is a collective security organization. NATO was never a collective security organization. These people should be sent back to IR schools to know what collective security means. It's a collective defense organization. It's always for or against somebody. A collective defense organization is always towards an external threat. There is always othering. NATO has survived by othering. It was never an inclusive organization. Now, it was a defensive organization during the Cold War, did great things protecting Europe, but that's it. Trying to say there's a NATO identity, well, Turkey and Greece, there's no identity there, for one thing. But to say that this will become global, there is an argument by James Lindsay and Ivo Daldar in Foreign Affairs who think that there should be a global NATO. And other countries should be asked to join the club. And if you do this club, expand the club, it will be a great thing. My question is, who is going to run that club? Is Korea going to run the club? Koreans and Japanese are interested in partnership in NATO. Are they going to run the club? Is Australia going to run the club? No, it will be run by the United States. So a global NATO basically is another way of reviving recreating an American hegemony which has become increasingly unsustainable because of all the changes that have happened in the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Acharya. Thank you to CCCB, and thank you to Global Codes for this very, very interesting talk. Hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Thank you very much.